What I'm going to do is just go through them. Okay, so that's one that's sort of pretty much good. That's another one that's pretty much good.
So you're selecting them, Alistair?
I'm just picking through the ones that are sort of perfect and separating them from the ones that are not so perfect.
Right.
So the ones that are perfect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slice them with 4 cuts, and then those can be pickled, and those are the ones you sort of, you know, you can keep for a year or so.
Right.
Yeah, I've got a jar that's from last year. You can see they're all sort of still pretty much perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sliced,
wow.
On each quarter.
I've got someone coming to the door. Sorry, I have to skip out for a few minutes. Sorry, guys.
Okay. Oh, it's an excited dog. Now, those are the ones that are a bit less perfect, and you see they got a few marks, and they're perhaps a bit wrinkly because I've had that box for a little while now, and some of them are dried out a bit. Those ones I'm going to treat differently.
Alistair?
Yes?
Would you mind, when you put something up close to the camera, could you lift it up a little bit higher? I could just see the top of your hand there rather than the old. That's too high. Yeah. About there is great. Me.
Perfect.
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
How's that?
No, much better. Thank you.
Sorry, I haven't practiced with this thing very much, so it's all very experimental.
Good.
Okay, so that's the sort of the selecting process. The next thing you got to do is just give them a very quick wash. You're not trying to get any sort of major stuff off. You just want to give them a wash and make sure that they're reasonably clean. So that's just sort of put them under the tap and rinse them around a bit. So nothing particularly sort of fancy about that. It's just a rinsing process to get any residual sort of muck off them if there's anything. They're pretty clean, so it's not a big deal. But you just want to make sure, because any process like this, where you're doing a preserving process, you want to get rid of any sort of foreign contaminants and things like that, because sometimes the thing can go off in strange ways. Not so much with salted olive pickling, but with things like beer and other preserves. You can get sort of I'm just going to change the camera angle now. You can get funny things happening. So that's the next process. Now, once you've done that, you've got 2 choices. You can either slice them or smash them, all right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you're going to slice them, what you're going to do is take a knife, coming back. Yes, looking for a jar.
While Alistair's finding a jar, I'm just reminding you all that we are planning on recording this workshop. So if you don't want your voice to be recorded, then you might be better off saving your questions for the chat, typing them in. And if any other way, if that makes you feel uncomfortable, please let me know. Otherwise, we will be recording this just for the benefit of those who were unable to join.
Fine. Okay. So have here an olive and a knife, and you make 1 cut around, and you make 2 cuts around. And that's it. You just keep on doing that. This is obviously something you want to do at a time when you've got a bit of time on your hands, like you're watching television or listening to music or something like that. So that's the cutting operation. And that's, as I said, was that a question?
Them? What's the purpose of cutting them all the way around?
Ah, okay. The purpose of cutting them or bruising them or whatever you do to them is to allow the salt mix to get into the olive and to preserve it, and also to extract some of the bitter principles in the olive. So olives in their natural state are not particularly sort of fun to eat. I have seen birds eat them, but most people wouldn't want to eat them. So what you're doing with the salting is, one, you're preserving them for sort of later in the year, and two, you're extracting some of those bitter principles. So the first month or so, you change the water every week, and that gets the bitter stuff out. And then after that, you can change it once a month or something like that. It's not so critical. So the olive itself is pretty darn waterproof. If you don't cut it, absolutely nothing will happen. It'll just sit there, and in 6 months' time, you'll have sort of unchanged olives sitting in brine. All right, so that's maybe enough of the cutting operation to show you how that works. The next thing I'm going to do is just create some brine, some salt solution to put into that. And for that, what you need, just this, is 100 grams of salt. So that's a little photography scale that I've got there. It weighs 100 grams very neatly. If you're doing it on a kitchen scale, you either need a very sensitive kitchen scale, or you perhaps need to weigh 200 grams at a time. Otherwise, it's just a little bit difficult. But that's 100 there. And what I'm going to do is dissolve that in a litre of water. Oh, there's a jug. Okay.
Cold water, Alistair?
Now, with these things, you start off with hot water, and I'm going to put these other olives somewhere else. Looking for another container? I'm looking for another container. Put them in.
Too big?
You start off with hot water to dissolve the salt a bit more quickly. I'll put them outside. Okay, so I've got a large jug. Got 500 mils of hot water. And the same amount of cold. And you just dissolve that. It takes a little while to dissolve, but not a huge amount of time. Now, you're going to need quite a lot of salt to do this. That's the first thing you have to realize, because you need to do this once a week for the first month, and then once a month. So you're going to use sort of about, I don't know, probably a kilogram or two of salt eventually. And there. Obviously, I need a lot more olives in that jar, but I'll leave that for the moment.
Alistair, does it matter what salt you need?
Ah,
would you use iodized or uniodized?
Okay, definitely use uniodized salt, because iodized salt, the iodine in it will react with the other stuff and you'll get this funny looking brown color. So iodized salt's not a good idea. The best salt to use is either salt specifically for pickling, so coarse salt, pickling salt, or swimming pool salt. Now, swimming pool salt is incredibly pure, and because people buy it in 20-kilo bags, it's incredibly cheap. So find somebody with a swimming pool and get a couple of kilos of salt from them. That's my advice.
Thank you.
It's all right. Just readjust that. Okay, so that's making the brine. That's cutting the olives. Now the other alternative, if you want your olives more quickly, okay, or if they're a bit sort of less than pretty looking, is to squash them. Right. So I'm going to go and get the squashing apparatus from outside, and we'll demonstrate that. I need another plate. Okay. Pop another plate. Like one would be fine. All right, so for squishing them, what you want is a beer bottle like that, and it should have a dished bottom on it. I don't know if you can see that, but it's slightly dished in the base. So when you whack it down on the olive doesn't go sort of out the door in the opposite direction, which it's quite inclined to do anyway. Just sort of tilting this round. Okay. So there's your olive, and you go whack, whack. And eventually it sort of breaks a little bit. You can see here's a bunch that I squished beforehand. And basically it's broken the skin. The olive inside is now exposed, and the salt water will get into that quite quickly. So those will be ready to eat probably within 6 weeks. You don't have to wait sort of a long time to get results out of that. But they are obviously a bit squished and not as pretty as the other ones. So you tend to do that with the ones that sort of don't look as nice, or you have to take a nick out of anyway to get rid of some sort of you know, less than optimal piece of the olive. Okay, so now the only step we haven't gone into is weighting the olives down. The problem with olives is they float. So what you wind up with is you wind up with a jar of brine with a space at the bottom, and then the olives floating up to the top. And if they float up to the top and they're exposed to air, they tend to become discolored and they don't look very nice at all, and you get various other things happening. So what you need to do is you have to put something on them to keep them in the water, or have a jar that's totally full, or any other arrangement like that. So there's a couple of options. The simplest and nicest option is basically put a big rock on top of them. Here I have a selection of various flat rocks. Now, you need ones that are the right size for your jar, and you don't want them too thick or heavy, because then they will sink to the bottom. So it's a little bit of a sort of a tricky operation. There are other ways of doing it. There are jars you can get that originally contain pickled olives. And I've got one here. So containers like this have a lid that is designed to push down into the liquid and exclude air. Get one of those. That's an ideal thing to have. If you can't, you're basically back to using rocks, or the other option is a plastic bag filled up with water, and then pop that into the top of the fermenting jar. Okay, so I've covered the basics. I'd like to hear if anybody's got queries or thoughts on what other things I might want to do. Or yep. So over to you. Questions.
Alistair, does the jar have to be airtight?
Okay. It doesn't have to be totally airtight, because
Yes.
the pickling process is going to generate a certain amount of gas, and not to have much in the way of space at the top rather than airtight, because you don't want oxygen getting into the olives, because that tends to, as I say, discolor them. And the other thing you'll find is you very often get a sort of a thin layer of white mold on the top, which is sort of looks horrible, but it's not really a problem. You just wash it off, rinse, and replace the brine with fresh brine, and away you go. So Makona jars are fine, but if you do use a Makona jar, realize that the lid will move up over time, and you get a little bit of leakage of the brine out. So you need to put it on a plate in your cupboard, or with a bit of newspaper underneath it, to sort of stop the brine getting out and causing mischief.
Alistair, does it matter, or are there different times for green and black olives? And also, what's the optimum time when you're brining the perfect olives?
Okay, right. The answer basically is the timing doesn't change much. The thing that the timing depends on is whether you've cut them or if you've squashed them. If you squash them, they're going to go really fast. A month to 2 months' time, they're going to be ready to eat. They're not going to be sort of suitable for keeping for a long time. If you've cut them, they'll be fine in a year's time. They'll be fine in 18 months' time. You can start basically eating them after about 4 or 5 months. So timing is not that critical. Definitely leave them for about 2 months before you try them out. But anytime after 6 months, they'll be. So you either want to use them in a recipe where you would normally add salt, but you don't have to add salt then, or give them a good washing before you eat them, because you will find they are saltier than you're used to. They'll be a lot saltier than the commercial olives that you buy in the deli or supermarket.
You call the coloured ones separately from the green ones.
Wendy's just brought up a plate of the coloured ones, and to make them look nice and uniform, you pickle them separately, because otherwise you get a very strange looking mixture of stuff. So yep, sort through your olives, get them to be uniform looking, and put like with like rather than try and mix them up. Mixing them up is not a great idea. How are we going?
Yeah. Alistair, Wendy Pryor here. If you're wanting to add herbs and spices and that sort of thing, at what stage would you do that?
Okay. If you want to enhance them with herbs and spices and bay leaves and stuff like that, what you do is you get them right through the pickling process to the end. So say if you've kept them in the pickle for 5 months or 6 months, then at that stage you take them out of the brine, and you add them into whatever else you're going to serve them in. So you add in the oil and the herbs and things like that at that stage. But once you've done that, bear in mind they're not going to keep as long as they will in brine. So they'll be okay for a month or so, but if you if once they're out of the brine, their life tends to be limited, because they're not being sort of confined by the osmotic pressure of the salt, and they tend to sort of fall apart basically.
Right.
Do you need to sterilise jars, Alistair, before you use them?
You need to make them pretty clean. They do not need to be sort of hospital grade sterile, but they need to be cleaned out. So just rinse them out with a bit of hot water or something like that, and make sure there's no sort of gunge lurking at the bottom of them. So not super sterile, but good and clean. With things like wine and beer, you need a much higher level of sterilization, because the wild yeasts and bugs like that are often fitter than the tame ones that you're using to do your fermentation. But with olive pickling, you're not doing a lot of fermentation. You don't really care about which creatures are doing it. So it's mainly the salt doing the work for you.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know how Joel's going with the rest of them. I'm running out of stuff to say. This is why I'm asking for questions at the moment. Are you sort of all clear on the processes for cutting them and squashing them and stuff like that? It's not super complicated, but the first time you do it, you need to sort of just be careful and make sure you don't sort of totally squash the olives.
This is the size that you buy from House Farm.
Okay, Wendy is bringing a box over to me. There's the bottle falling over. I think disastrous. That's a 5 kilogram box from Harris Farm.
Do 6 of these.
That'll do sort of 5 1 kilo jars, in other words. So it might be more than you want. The smart move might be to find somebody else who wants some, and you each take half.
Yeah. If you're getting them for tree, separate them by size.
Now the other thing is, if you happen to have an olive tree, or if you happen to have a neighbour with an olive tree, and a lot of neighbours have olive trees but don't actually collect the olives, make sure you go through them and separate them into the small ones and the big ones. Because what you get from Harris Farm has been carefully graded, so they're all the same size. What you get picking them off the tree, you'll get small ones, big ones, plump ones, ripe ones, green ones, all sorts of stuff. So quite important to sort of separate them out into equal sizes, because obviously the small ones will go through the picking process quicker, and the big ones will take a bit longer.
Have you any tips, Alistair, for harvesting olives? I do have a tree, no fruit on it at the moment, but
Well, the first tip is make sure you get the variety of olive that produces fruit in your neighbourhood. We've had trouble with that too.
no, I've had lots of fruit. Ours just got a severe haircut last year. That's all.
Right, okay. Look, the only thing is make sure that you keep an eye on the tree and decide whether you want to pick them when they're purple or green, and get at them before some other critter gets at them. Because there are some birds that seem to be quite fond of olives, I've found, but they're not as bad as any other fruit. I mean, the raspberries and strawberries are much more palatable.
The sulphur-crested cockatoos seemed to have a picnic with mine last time.
They'll chomp on anything. I mean, it doesn't have to be edible. If it's sort of chewy and nice, they'll have a go at it and spit out the results. You just need to sort of tell them that they're not welcome, and make noises like an owl or something.
Oh no, they sit in the tree and pull faces at me.
Yes, I know that idea. Yeah.
And laugh too. Someone said they had another recipe. So is that anyone in this crowd other than the salt pickle?
Wendy's asking if anybody else had another recipe. And I think the answer is probably no.
Okay.
Nope.
Because we have come across the references to a lye process, but we don't recommend it.
Okay. Wendy's pointing out that there are other processes for preserving olives and processing olives. They tend to use fairly nasty chemicals like lye, which is basically either sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide or caustic soda. So it's quite a nasty chemical. It's not recommended for home use. I think some of the commercial processors use it probably because it's a bit quicker or something like that. No, not necessary in the home circumstances, and not a nice sort of chemical to have to handle.
Definitely.
I have a question, Alistair, or if anyone else knows about how to pit olives.
You can get olive pitting devices. Now, to get the pits out of them before you've pickled them, I don't think that's very easy. But as I say, the squashing method tends to separate the pip a fair bit from the rest of the flesh, so the pips are easy to get out then. Once you've pickled them, what we tend to do is just slice off the flesh and use that in recipes rather than trying to get the pit out, because it sticks very solidly to the flesh in most cases. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's my experience.
No, that's good. Thank you.
I could actually hold up one of the split olives, brushed olives, and show how easy it is to get the pip out.
Okay. I am now move some of this stuff out of the way. Here is an olive I've squashed already. You want to extract the pip from that. It's not too hard, but it does tend to want to hang on a bit. So there we go. Olive and pip separated.
Right.
Yep. So yeah, it is possible, but whether it's worthwhile depends on what your need is, I guess.
That was great. Thank you, Alistair.
Okay. How are we going, Joel? Did we find any others?
I put a few calls in, but no one else that was able to join. But they're looking forward to seeing the recording.
All right. Well, I think we might have enough at this stage. I'm trying to think of anything else I need to tell people. Yeah, as I say, the first couple of weeks, the first month or so, you do need to change the water weekly, and you do need to keep a lookout for sort of stuff growing in there and try and wash it off and get rid of it. But none of these things are really sort of very terrible. Most of them wash off quite happily. But yeah, try and exclude air from the top of the jar. Try and exclude oxygen from the top of the jar as much as possible, because it just makes it sort of a lot easier and nicer. There you go. That's it.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Much.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to my next crop of olives, Alistair, and I'll give it a try.
Yes. Oh, lovely. Yep. I know. Mandy Stubbs did some of her tree or her neighbour's tree just recently, so we'll see how she goes.
Oh, good. Thank you once again. That was great.
All right. No trouble.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're ending it.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. Thanks
Bye.
for joining.
Bye.
Bye.
You.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Alistair.
Bye.
Cheers.